Well, hello, Brooke. It's so nice to come back from break.
I know, it's so good to see you.
And we're so excited to have a special guest with us, Gail Brenner. Hi, Gail.
Hi, thrilled to be here with you guys.
We've
Thank you.
actually been trying to arrange this for quite a while because we met
Almost
you
a
at
year.
Almost a year. I know I'm realizing because of sand, we're almost at the year mark.
Yeah.
we met Gail last year at the Science and Non-Duality Conference. And as you probably heard in the intro, Gail has probably one of my favorite combinations, which is someone with a background in psychology who found awakening and brought it into their client sessions. And this really, to me, is this intersection or interplay of how psychology and spirituality could or cannot play together is always a really interesting field of curiosity for me. So we were so excited to have you on. And then, Gail, you sent us your newest book, because this isn't the only book you've written, right? Correct in saying that. Your newest book, which was called or is called Suffering is Optional. Now, we love that title. And we thought maybe the most useful place to begin this conversation is to just begin with the title and what you mean when you say suffering is optional.
Okay. I love that question because I think that people can go into their minds and not understand what that means. And I'm suffering and suffering is optional. So what is she talking about? So it's a really good starting place. And what I mean is that not that you'll never suffer again in your whole life, but in any moment, it's possible to find our way through if we're stuck in some kind of conditioned pattern, if there's a strong emotion, if we have a history of, that we're dealing with trauma from the past and we're trying to find our way through that. It really comes down to the moment, to understanding and what our experience is in the moment, turning toward it, really understanding the mechanics of how our suffering works. And then that gives us a foundation to be able to move through it. And I'm sure we'll talk about more of that as we go. But you can bring skills and resources and compassion and love to that experience in the moment in very specific ways that help us to realize the peace that's possible here and now and always.
Mm. Yeah, and I love that you said understanding the mechanics of it almost. And I
I
think,
love that
yeah,
too.
I know you and I both love that
I
little
like, ding,
mechanical term.
love it.
One of the key mechanics pieces, which I think you did a great job of giving a tour of in the book, is conditioning. And I'll speak for myself, on this path, I had an idea of what conditioning was when I started out, and then I just kept going and going and going and discovering, oh my god, well, what is not conditioning in me? So I'm
Yeah.
curious because I feel like you gave a great depthful view in an experiential way of like, okay, well, what does this actually mean? What is conditioning actually? So how would you explain that?
Well, we talk about conditioned patterns, and these are repetitive ways of thinking or feeling or emotions that come up or our behavior. And when there's a certain kind of pattern repeating in our lives, the word conditioned means learned. So it's not natural, it's not, just given as our birthright. It's something that we learn over time. And if we're free of conditioning, there are no patterns that are running in those moments. So if we're stuck or if we feel badly or if there's some thought pattern that's grabbing our attention that makes us feel like we're not living our full potential, living fully in our lives, that's always an invitation to bring our attention into our experience. And when I say experience, I always mean direct experience. Like, what is it that's here in this moment that's making me suffer? And if you look at it, if anyone looks at it, and I've done this a lot in my own experience, you see that there's some kind of thought pattern that's running. There might be emotions and there might be sensations in the body and some energetic pattern that, or some sense of contraction that our bodies have gotten used to feeling that's very familiar to us. but there's also some kind of story or belief or something running in the mind. And I used to do this a lot, just really like observe my experience intensely. And once I started doing that, it was so illuminating because I saw exactly why I was suffering. I was able to uncover the beliefs, and sometimes the beliefs are kind of subtle. You have to really give them some time to come to the surface. And you can realize, like, oh, I'm believing, that I can't trust this other person. And if that's a belief that you're having and that causes you to feel separate, that's the source of the suffering. And to understand where our attention goes, that is bringing about this sense of suffering or unhappiness in our lives, is super valuable because it paves the way to being free of it.
Mm-hmm.
I know this is going to sound like an awfully simplistic question, but I think it'll be interesting to just hear from you because you have years of experience, not just working with yourself, but working with others.
Mm-hmm.
So it sounds like it is your experience that whenever someone is really suffering, that's sitting across from you in the room, or when you've caught yourself in this, what we could call optional suffering, you will find a narrative, right? So in other words, it's never just a physical experience, just attention or emotion. There really is always a belief that's triggering that internal dynamic. That's your experience?
There has to be, because a sensation in and of itself doesn't mean anything. And a sensation, even a strong sensation or a strong, and I don't even want to call it feeling at this point, I want to call it sensation. So the physical aspect of an emotion, there's nothing there if we don't make anything of it. It's just sensation. Mm-hmm. And even in the, precision of the moment, if we take away time and space, there's nothing there at all. So the way that meaning is added to our experience is through the mind. And that's why the answer to your question is absolutely yes. There's always a narrative of some kind, like, oh, I don't like that sensation. Or, oh, that means this. That means, that I'm still not over all that crap that happened in my childhood. And when we add meaning to it, that's verbal, right? It's in the mind and it's thought-based. And as soon as we're in our minds and not with our direct experience, we experience separation. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So yes, there's always a narrative. I mean, the shortcut to the end of suffering is to not believe any thought. And I mean, literally no thoughts, to just be still, to not move, to let forms come and go, whatever they might be, not attached to them, and be the field of stillness that these arise in. That's the shortcut. And I know there's a lot to say beyond that, because that's hard for people to just always be able to get to that experience. But it's always about thought in the end.
I think it points to that rabbit hole Brooke was saying in the question she posed about taking a tour of your own conditioning. Is, I think when I first was on my path studying psychology and then, bringing it into spirituality later, you think, oh, okay, I have certain beliefs that are conditioned, certain thoughts, like certain painful experiences. And it opens up this huge exploration to say, wait, what if I didn't trust any of these thoughts that are coinciding with suffering?
It's revolutionary to think that. And the thing that makes it difficult is the mind says, wait a minute, it's not the awakened awareness that says that. It's the mind that says, you can't not believe any thoughts. How are you going to function? And then fear starts to come up for people. And there's a lot of entanglement around that. But in the end, it gets very simple, not believing any thought. And then when that is your experience, then there's a resting in this stillness.
Yeah, it's interesting because as I've noticed, there can be these like alpha thoughts that you don't even notice, right? And one of them would be, oh, there's something wrong with me. Or if I'm on this path, it's that I am excavating the not true things or the bad things. And it's still kind of the mind working on the mind and getting rid of all the wrong things or the bad things. And in my experience, when I overemphasized that, what's got to go, what's not true, and I thought it was from the being, but the mind was actually operating, that
Yeah.
it caused, it didn't feel great. You know, it caused a lot of disorientation, a lot of fear. And I understand that from the point of view of the mind. And one of the things that I found very helpful was being able to emphasize for myself what I am and not just what I'm not. And your book gets to the heart of that quite a lot. So I'm curious, and I've seen this with clients of mine a lot too, that if we can't really bathe in what we actually are, if we're not our conditioning, if we're not our thoughts, if we're not our emotions even, it can get tricky. So how would you, and I realize this is a ginormous question,
Yeah.
but how would you give people even just pointers of, this is a way that you can, one way, touch what you are and not just what you are not?
That happens by grace. I want to say it's, we can take a breath first of all. So the first thing would be to slow everything down. So if there's a lot of thought running, a lot of worry or fear, or I don't have this, or I don't get this, or whatever, the first thing is just to take a breath and pull attention away from that kind of thought pattern, because that only serves to increase the sense that you don't have what you're looking for.
Yeah.
So if you feel like you don't have what you're looking for, it's the thoughts that are telling you that it's not here right now. So taking a breath and just relaxing away from those thoughts and just giving it a moment. And I often, with clients and myself, I use the breath as a way in. Mm-hmm. So you take a breath, and we can try it right now, just take a breath and then put your attention on the sensations of the breath. And then as you do that, you've automatically let go of the attachment to whatever story happens to be running in the moment. And so taking a breath and the sensations on the breath, and then, taking a couple of breaths and then letting go of the attention on the breath, and just, not to put a lot of effort into it, but just to open to all that's here. Yeah. And sometimes that might mean just opening to whatever is coming in through your senses. Mm-hmm. So letting whatever comes in through sight or hearing just be here. Yeah. And that might not be, the full enchilada of awakening, but it's definitely a way to relax from the thoughts, from the content of the thoughts, and to open to what's here in the present moment. That's definitely an important step. We all know what it's like to get caught up in the revved up mind, right? And then it's this hurricane of thoughts that are coming through. And when that's happening, what comes with that is contraction in the body. But to take a breath right in the middle of that and just to relax away from it and allow that relaxation to happen, that can be just a simple but really beneficial tool for people.
Yeah.
Sure, because we may all know what it's like to be caught up in our thoughts, but we also know those moments where we're not.
Yes.
Right? And that's a beautiful thing to be pointed to. I'd love to read a quote from your book that you had in the very beginning of the book, because I think it outlines things so beautifully. And it also points to some of the patterns of thought that you were pointing to in particular in the book, which is the limiting identity or patterns of belief of unworthiness. So you said, freedom from the limiting identity that you're unworthy is available in any moment. Mm-hmm. The path is direct. You realize false beliefs that have taken hold and open to the possibility of returning your attention to being aware now. Then you're able to fully live, unveiled and overflowing with life-giving potential. So I love that quote because you outlined sort of the dilemma that most people are sitting with inside of themselves, but also what it feels like when you liberate yourself from that construct, this fully live, unveiled, and overflowing potential, which is so lovely. So again, a fairly simplistic question, but why is this so hard for us? What makes it so sticky? I mean, Brooke and I were discussing, we are way more fluid with this than we've ever been in our lives, but we're people who are devoted to truth. And even sometimes we're getting lost in the trance of our own belief systems in any given moment. What makes this so sticky for people?
Well, a pattern like unworthiness, it hasn't formed yesterday, right? It comes from our childhoods, probably for most people, or at least at some point when we were young. And it's very highly conditioned. The groove of that pattern in our minds, in our brains, in our bodies is very, very, very strong. And we've come to identify with it. So, I'm unworthy. We use that language, or I feel unworthy. We don't say unworthiness is here. We identify it so personally. And then it has so many effects of how we are in our relationships, how we make choices in our lives, how we interpret any experience that we happen to be in. It becomes a very thick veil that we're looking through in how we live our lives. And it's sticky. But I don't want to see it as, I know it feels bad, but I don't want to see it as a negative thing. I really want to frame it as an opportunity, because it's always an opportunity. It's like, yes, wow, I just saw that this pattern took hold again. And that is so great, because it is the opportunity to be free of it. If you're unconscious of it and just in it and it's running, there's nothing really to do about that. There has to be that moment of waking up out of it, or of like, wow, I'm suffering right now, or something that causes a bit of a gap so that you can observe the pattern instead of being 100% embroiled in it. And when that moment happens, it doesn't matter if it happens 1,000 times a day. It's like, yay, I have this moment now where I can observe this, I can untangle it, I can, there are lots of things you can do with it other than just be stuck in it. And so, yes, these patterns are very sticky, and they can be, but there are lots of tools that we can bring to them to help to soften them. And I think softening, I'm kind of, my sort of thinking about all of this, it kind of shifts over time. And right now I'm into softening that pattern, that, that I'm unworthy, I'm bad, this is bad, and all that brings to our lives. Is very strong, and as we know, very harsh and painful. And to bring softening to that, and if that's by taking a breath, or by just kind of, even physically, like holding it, or just allowing it to be there, just being like, okay, pattern, you're really having a hard time right now, but I can be here with you. And not to have that like resistance, like I need to get rid of that, because that only adds to the harshness. So to see it as an opportunity, to welcome it in, to soften with it, to breathe with it, to allow it, to stop fighting with it. That's the thing. We fight with this pattern because it feels so uncomfortable. But when we allow ourselves to end that fight, it's so useful, because then it's like, it's just another thing that arises. It's like, a child that, you care for it like you would care for a child, and you wouldn't reject a child who feels bad. You would come and hold that. And that's a way to think of that I think can be really useful for people and help to kind of soften the hold that this pattern has.
Yeah. Yeah, and you talk very skillfully in your book about how we turn towards these patterns, because I think we have this orientation, all of us, that we need to cross the finish line as quickly as possible, and then we'll be the good people. And of course, this is all coming from the separate self, or the mind, or whatever you want to call it. And so when another layer comes up to the surface, and there is that gap, like you're saying, it's so merciful that we can see it instead of believing we are it. When that
and can I just
up,
add, so that
yeah.
can I just add, so that brings us to we're always at the finish line. That's the thing. There's no finish line. It's always here. It's who we are we've never not been who we are. It's impossible. So it's always here and available to know that. And so the question is not how can I get what I don't have, but how can I unveil the entanglements that I feel right now that feel very real, to find what I know must be here somewhere in this moment. It's a complete shift in how we work with our experience, because we stop believing what those thoughts of unworthiness are telling us. The thoughts of unworthiness tell us that we don't have something, if only I, knew how to do this right. If only I got this thing that this other guy seems to have, this happiness, she seems happy, like, why don't I have it? That's just more of the same thought pattern. It's believing that pattern. But when we go, wait a minute, that thought pattern is not speaking the truth. It's not supportive. It's not my ally in this moment. So how can I shift that around so that I can, as you said, turn toward? It's always turning toward, bringing it in. It's not something that's out there at some future time in some future place.
Yeah, I love the already at the finish line. That's great. That's a great pointer. Yeah, and what might you say, your book goes into detail with a lot of ways of meeting ourselves, but what is one example you might give of how to turn toward this? I think first, like you were saying, the gap already huge, that we're not seeing through its eyes, but we see, oh, there must be a thought form running about unworthiness. I think the awareness is already enormous. And if it's still running, feels like sensations in the body, feels like emotions, what are some ways you would say to make that more workable, just to uncover that?
Well, one thing is definitely to bring an attitude of curiosity to that investigation. So if the attitude is, I'm going to do this so I can get rid of these feelings that feel so badly, it's like you're trying to make I want to say you're trying to make a deal with God. I'll turn toward myself if you take this away from me.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know about you, but it doesn't work for me.
I have totally tried. It has never seemed
It's
to
never
work.
worked. I've tried countless times.
Yeah. So the getting rid of I'll turn toward if I can get rid of this, with the goal. There's no goal, because a goal is in time. I'll do this if I get that. There's time there, right? There's it's something that we hope to get in the future if we apply the right strategy. It's really not like that. It's about more and more going deeply into what's here right now, and seeing how we can uncover that by turning toward our experience, by being curious about where our attention is going, that's making us feel like this pattern is so real right now in this moment. So that's about the thought part of it. And also, we could talk a lot about the emotions and the feelings that come with it, turning toward our physical experience, the sensations and the energies that run through the body, and bringing a great, huge field of acceptance to that, to allow those sensations to be. That this is another thing about a long-standing pattern. There's definitely a pattern of physical contraction that goes with that, and I know you talk about that a lot on your podcast. And it's so important to know that. And these sensations, they need time, they need love, they need coaxing, but in a really kind way. They need kindness. It's like just to create this huge field and just allow sensations to come in whatever way they want to. So there's a freedom there, right? The sensations are free to come. And sometimes, and I know this from my own experience, it takes a while. It takes because there's hidden parts there. This is what separation is. There are parts that go out of our unconscious because they've been too painful from the past, or we haven't had the skills to deal with them. So we just kind of turn away and come up with some kind of coping skills to get through life. But in doing that, we're turning away to the bare bones of the conditioned pattern. And we want to turn our attention to that, to give that the space to come out. and that meaning the sensations and the energies and what we have to submerge in order to cope in our early lives. We want to bring the space for all of that to come to the surface, to be illuminated, to be welcomed into awareness.
Mm-hmm.
For sure. I know earlier in my life, I was so afraid of feeling those feelings. You know, the kind of dialogue would be something like, I'll fall apart or I'll lose it. And that's something, you know, people often say things like that. And what's interesting is, practically speaking or experientially speaking, when I've experienced the sensations without the narratives, they're actually no problem. Yes. I mean, that's my experience, right? I don't know anyone else's, but they do move. They're, you know, I think one thing I'd love to bring into the foreground is that meaning making thought process, mm-hmm. because, you know, a lot of people who are listening to this show, certainly Brooke and I, are savvy enough to know it can't be true that I'm unworthy. I know it feels it, but I've read every book and everyone says I'm not unworthy. That can't be true. But that sneakier or subtler thought process that happens around, but I should be able to know I'm worthy already. Oh, it's not right that I feel unworthy. Those are those secondary thought streams that I don't think we realize are conditioning. Mm-hmm. I think most people think those thoughts are almost their awareness observing the belief that they're unworthy. So I'd love to just open this up, bringing back to what you spoke about earlier, how what we're afraid of actually isn't so scary in met direct experience, and how that meaning-making voice in our head is part of the conditioning itself, if I'm hearing you correctly.
Absolutely. Yes, that's the case. And yes, that's my experience also. And it's the truth when we don't add, because the struggle around emotions or sensations comes from that narrative. If we take that narrative away, I mean, truly take it away completely, like turn off thought just for a moment, it's just, there's nothing there that's damaging or even scary. It's just sensation. Yeah. And then it's I want to say a blessing to like give that sensation the space to just be without manipulating it with the thought process, the meaning making process. Because so say there's a sensation or an emotion that wants to come from awareness, and then the mind goes, it's too hard, or I don't want to, or I'll fall apart, or I'll cry forever, or whatever else the mind is saying. It all that does is keep it stuck. You know, and it's energy that wants to move. And like you said, when it has that space to move, it just does. It might get worse. It might get better. It might, who knows what it's going to do. And it's not our business what it does. Our business is to give it the space to be. And this is the thing, when we don't get in the way of these patterns unraveling, they naturally want to unravel. You know, and we can give them the gift of that acceptance and space and curiosity, and not the push and pull, like, I want to get rid of this, or this means I'm bad, or, you know, and so I guess one of the things I'm getting, you know, one of the real nuggets out of this conversation so far is that meaning making voice of the mind, and to really notice that and see, like, well, what is your experience without making any meaning out of it at all? Mm-hmm. And just to be, because that takes you right into direct experience.
Yeah. I love that. Not my business.
I love that too. That was like a ding ding.
I mean, your patterns are not your business. Really, they're just like they've kind of gotten inserted. And when I say they're not your business, the you that it's not your business of is the free you, the unconditioned you. Mm-hmm. So the patterns are just an appearance that make you believe that you're separate, but they're just like, you know, there's just different objects running through consciousness. That's really what that is.
I love that. Yeah. I'm going to be returning to that one quite a lot. And talking about the unconditioned self, the mind has a lot of arguments about what the unconditioned self will look like. And so I just wanted to bring a few of those into the conversation. And you had one, I'm going to read a quote from your book that a client asked you, and certainly, you know, we've heard this before. I've had this question before myself. And the question was, how will I live without thinking? Won't I just sit on the couch like a blob? And there is this idea that unconditioned self looks a certain way, whether it's the one that lays around and accomplishes nothing, or the blissed out person, you know, who's just like tripping out on seeing fairies all the time, or whatever the ideas that the mind has about it. So for that specific question, how would you answer that? Like, without thinking, how will I do anything?
So I recommend an experiment for people around that, which is to take, you know, a couple hours or a half a day on a weekend or something, and really have it completely unplanned, and just let yourself be moved. So you do whatever you're doing, you lay in bed and wait until there's a movement to do something. And if you don't get the movement, you don't do it. But just to not have it come from the to-do list or the shoulds or the familiarity of what I always do, but to let that sort of radical expression of awareness come through you, with, again, getting out of the way of it and letting it unfold without the mind, and just to do the experiment and see what happens. You know, there are lots of ways you can do that. You go into the grocery store and you throw your list away and just see where you're moved. You know, and then you begin to recognize that there's a deeper intelligence that's here. Like it's like a guide or an inner voice or an intelligence, or, you know, different words for it. But we begin to recognize that maybe that is really the case. You know, we've all heard about it, but maybe it is right here, and maybe you can follow it, and that it's okay. It can be trusted. And I know that it's hard for people, especially if you're very mind-based, to consider what is it like without the mind. But, you know, it doesn't have to be an all or nothing situation. You can just try it out and see what it's like, and begin to trust that there's something way more efficient, way more loving than the mind. And we begin to be able to trust that. It's how I live now, and I mean, it's just absolutely amazing. You know, the mind, and I also want to say to mind people, you plan, you know, you make things, you don't get lost, you know, when you're out in traffic. You know, the mind is there in a functional way to do what it needs to do. And, you know, you take care of yourself, and that kind of, it's part of the whole intelligence of it all. But in the bigger decisions, you know, when I'm working with a client and they're trying to decide between, you know, A and B, I always ask them, just be quiet for a second and go in, and what's the gut feeling, or what's the inner feeling? They always know the answer. They may not want to follow it, but there's always something there that's you know, moving you. That is that movement, and it's not of the mind. It's of the greater intelligence that is kind of playing in form out here in the world.
One of the things you mentioned in terms of meeting your direct experience was curiosity. And I know also in the book you spoke about kindness, and we're talking about acceptance and loving and non-harm and no agenda and this type of approach. And I know there are many people who never were really exposed to loving kindness early on. They didn't have a model for someone who had no agenda for them, or they didn't have a model for someone who met them with care. So can we speak a little bit more about what a process may look like for someone who is really struggling just to find a thread of kindness or compassion with themselves?
Sure. The word I like around that is attunement. And it's attuning to your own experience. So attune means well, let's think of it like if you're an adult and you're attuning to a child, you're seeing what that child is doing. You're kind of, your personal self is out of the way. You might be narrating, oh, now you're picking up the yellow toy. Now you're turning it over. Now now you look like you don't know what to do. This is attunement to the other's direct experience, right? And it's so loving and supportive and makes people feel completely seen when someone else is attuning to their experience. And as adults, I mean, good therapy is about that. A good therapist is going to attune in that way. Even when the person can't attune to himself or herself, the other who's holding the space can attune. And that can be so incredibly healing I want to say as a starting point, but definitely as a thread through a process of a therapy from helping someone heal from trauma. And so eventually, though, we can learn to attune to ourselves. And that's another way of bringing just infinite kindness to our own experience, allowing everything to be here, not judging this or that or choosing this or that, but being like, oh, this is here. Okay, this is here now. Yes. And it's this like continual yes or attunement to our own experience. And, another thing that I might want to suggest for people to play with, if this whole idea of attunement is really unfamiliar and not part of what you know or have experienced a lot in the past, attune to a pet, attune to another, a friend, just in a conversation, just like really get yourself out of the way and do this deep listening and feeding back and seeing what that does to the intimacy. Because when you attune to another or you attune to yourself, we're talking about like this complete intimacy, which eventually is no distance between that intimacy and your own experience. It's just the fully being with the arising of what is. But we can do that in this like play of separation where we can attune to others, we can attune to, just anything that's in our environment, so that we learn how to do that and eventually be able to attune deeply to our own experience, so much so that we don't have to exclude anything.
Yeah, and you're giving this feeling that I appreciate so much of how of deep listening and how different that can be, because I've seen in myself and I've seen in others, sometimes if we get kind of obsessed with what's wrong with me and we think we're doing healing, but we're really just the mind is giving us reasons to think there's things wrong with us and we'll cross the finish line, that it can become really unconsciously a form of profound self-absorption. And our healing journeys can just become this sort of echo chamber of I'm healing my stuff. And what you're describing provides this very direct and immediate way to shift into something that really feels very palpably like love, deep listening. I can just be with my friend or my dog or a tree, and sorry about that sound, and really attune. And suddenly, like you were saying before, it's not my business. I'm out of my own way because I'm really intimate with what's actually in front of me.
And it's actually a skill or a practice, let's say, that helps you to get out of the mind and into the now, right? It's because when we're attuning, we're so aware of what's happening right now. Attunement is not about the mind. It's about the aliveness of what's here right now and really seeing that, feeling that, and ultimately being one with that.
Beautiful.
What does the process look like as people are sitting with you? So do you still support people one-on-one, Gail?
Yeah.
I know you mentioned that in your book. Okay.
Yeah.
So when you have a client sitting with you, maybe they walk in for the first time, they just got referred to, and they're like, I don't know, they still believe their thoughts. They believe their beliefs must have some merit, or that they have to fix or improve themselves, these very common cultural ideas. How do you notice the process unfolding for everyone? Is it very different person to person? Is it different if someone's had a capital T trauma versus little t developmental trauma? Can we speak a little more about what it might look like for somebody as they are unraveling some of this investment in their belief?
So as you're asking that question, what came up in me is like, I don't know. I could put together an answer and I will, but I'm just really in the moment with what's happening, and it's just kind of going with what seems like the right next thing to do. But if I step away from that, I would say it's different because people have different experiences. People are stuck in different ways. Some people are more mental people. Some people are fear-based. Some people are more anger. That's where they get stuck. There's a lot of variety in what can show up.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, but the commonality is, as I hold a space for people, I don't believe their stories, and not in a way that I'm going to say I don't believe your story, but within myself, I know who they really are, and I hold that space for them, for myself, just for what is in that moment, and I'm always looking for ways to get in to help them recognize that their thoughts may not be logical, or that they're all in their thoughts and missing the whole feeling part of their experience, or whatever seems to be appropriate in the moment. But I don't get caught up. I don't believe the story. I don't see conventional therapy. I've had a lot of bad therapy in my life myself, and I think the therapists were all caught up in my own story, and it was just not helpful. But a therapist with a non-dual orientation is not gonna. They know who that person really is, which is not a person anyway. They know the non-separation, and then it's just, how do you get in and help the person become aware of what's already true anyway, even though they're very steeped in their own story and personal identity.
Yeah, and you've brought this up before, but I just want to say it again, especially for people who are listening, how really tremendously helpful it can be to have that therapeutic relationship where, that we're not just sitting at home unraveling ourselves, or, doing our self-care practices, or that to have somebody to hold that space is the game changer.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. And not to, I mean, lots of people watch tons of YouTube videos, and, and that's also super beneficial. But yeah, and in my own practice, I find even 1 or 2 sessions sometimes can be enough to just get them on a good path. But I also want to respond to what you said earlier, Vanessa, about the big T versus small t trauma. And it's, it's a matter of degree. I don't think they're qualitatively different experiences. It's just that one might be more foundational in the person's identity. It might be sitting stronger in their mind and their body. But, most, if not all of us, have had something that's caused this separation, that's made us feel like, we're separate beings. And, so we all have something there, unless we're 100% aware of it, that can be looked at with curiosity and inquired into. I'm struck recently with how many people there are in the world with a lot of anxiety, and I see it in my own practice, but just like people in general, I've just been coming across that a lot recently. And that also, I want to say, is optional. There are ways, and I don't want to present this because I know how hard anxiety can be to work with. There are ways to learn how to relate to this experience of anxiety that can really soften it. So for people out there who, feeling a lot of anxiety, there are ways to work with it.
I know one thing that was really helpful to me that I think you're illuminating in different words was over time, because I'm in the position of privilege where I get to work with people. So I get to hear their conditioned beliefs, right? And I'm sitting in this place where I know they're more than they think. I know there's more than their story. And then I would hear their stories and I would say, oh my God, I believe the same thing about myself. And I started to see that some of my beliefs were not so unique. And that's really interesting because the ego wants to believe it's the only one suffering. And oh my God, I feel unworthy. And there was something actually profoundly relieving in realizing, oh, wait a minute. 90% of the people I'm speaking with seem to think the same thing in only small variation on words. And that's how we can see this is such a human condition. And I think that's why you're pointing to big T, little t, developmental trauma, human trauma. It's the trauma of separation consciousness, right?
And in the end, that's what it is. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'd love to get into, before we have to end, the sacred return. And I'm going to be as general as that because that was my favorite chapter. I underlined a bunch. There was a lot of yes, 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 exclamation points. And so maybe we'll just have you share very broadly, what is the sacred return?
You know, it's coming back to our true home. And when we have even a taste of that, we know it. We somehow, it feels real. It feels right. It feels true that we don't have to believe the mind-based identity that we tell ourselves we are, whether it's that we feel inadequate or anything else, that we're incompetent. There's a possibility always of untangling that in the moment, maybe not forever, and it'll come back, but that doesn't matter because that gives you another opportunity. But it's like the healing of this separation. It's the finding of the place that was never separate, the allowing of the holding of everything, excluding nothing, and just, letting ourselves rest. It's the place of rest, and it's the place of non-doing. There's a lot, if you're in any way attached to the mind's way of thinking about things, there's so much doing and trying and, pressure to be different. And the sacred return is this resting in any moment in this timeless space where we, it doesn't need to do. It just is, and that's completely full in and of itself. It's the freedom from the personal identity or the sense of separation. And it's what's possible when we are able to just take a breath, just first of all, notice our patterns, because that's key. We need to have that observing presence, that loving awareness that notices, there's a pattern running here. And then noticing, there are thoughts that I'm attaching to, that attention is attaching to, the content of those thoughts, which is what makes thoughts seem real, attaching to the content of the thoughts. And then with this, a little bit of a gap, you can see, it's just some thought running. I don't have to pay attention to the content of it. And then the feelings and the sensations, and then the opening to the through the senses of what's here right now, and then going even beyond that to the fullness of the moment that's here energetically, the vibration of it, the aliveness that we feel when we're not attached to those thoughts. And we know that as a homecoming. If you've even had a taste of it, and I really think everyone has, they just haven't recognized it. A moment of seeing a sunset, or even when you sneeze, there's a moment of no mind in that, and we have these, we're not suffering 100% of the time. Our minds will tell us that we are. The mind doesn't see the gap, but there's always a gap, and that can be found. And to start to notice that, it's a beautiful gift that we can give to ourselves, to begin to notice that there's moments, maybe milliseconds, but that's great. That's a great beginning of being able to find the possibility of being free.
Beautiful. Well, thank you you, Gal. I don't know if there's anything else that you want to make sure to bring forward or that's on your mind for our listeners.
I guess the one thing I want to say is this idea of believing the content of the thoughts. Mm-hmm. So the content is the words, and this is going back to meaning. So what the words mean. So a thought, I am unworthy, like that's language, right? And language is always in the world of separation. So I am unworthy. These are words, you can look them up in the dictionary, we know what they mean. And it's possible to have an energy of thinking kind of floating through consciousness, or maybe like, a torrent of it coming through consciousness, but that's okay, without going into the content of it, without adding meaning. So it's like blah, 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 blah running through the mind without, so that doesn't have to disturb the piece that's here to be known in the moment. It's like, a thought appears, okay, no problem. The only way that it becomes a problem is when we attach to the content or the meaning of the words themselves. But if we just like think of it as a thought that comes in another language, or we have the inability to understand it, or we just get completely disinterested in it, like I am not interested in what that thought is telling me. There's a kind of congealed energy of a thought, but if you don't attach to the content, eventually it has nowhere to stick and it just loses its power.
Yeah. Loses the momentum, it sounds like. Yeah. The momentum. I would love to actually read one of your quotes before we wrap up, because I think it's such a beautiful place to be, really bring this conversation towards an end. You said, buried within us is a seed of knowing that we are so much greater than our imagined limits. Yeah. And this knowing tells us that the desire to search for a way out of this suffering can be trusted. Why? Because it is not your birthright to feel inadequate. Your essence is and always has been whole, loving, completely peaceful, primed for joy, and lacking nothing. It's your natural state available right now, and knowing this is where freedom lies. That is so beautiful, Gail. What an important reminder and offering to people.
Thank you. Yeah, I hope that inspires.
It does, very much so. Thank you.